G'day YouTube, Baubles on a lot here. With part 6 in the series of the partial book reading of One Crowded Hour, Tim Bowden's biography of Neil Davis, combat cameraman. Chapter 12, Saigon, Pearl of the Orient. However, I'm going to pass over the first 2 pages because basically Davis got an acute case of hepatitic jaundice, and in October 1965 he was sent back to Tasmania. I walked into a young doctor's surgery in Tasmania. He fortunately had an interest in tropical medicine. And the first thing he said was, "Thank Christ for a sick man." Like the American doctor in Saigon, he was bored and looking forward to an interesting case. It gave me great satisfaction to overcome my medical disabilities, and I have confidence that I can overcome any physical or mental problem that will happen to me. I'm never beaten psychologically, whether it is a social game of tennis or in my work or anything else. I will never admit defeat, even though I've had some fairly serious defeats, both on the tennis court and in my work. That philosophy was put to the test immediately Davis returned to Vietnam clear of eye and with a functioning liver. He slipped a disc, leaving him in constant pain and debilitation. So that he could support his camera gear and equipment, he wore a steel-ribbed back brace on his forays into the sweltering paddy fields and jungles of Vietnam during most of 1966 and 1967. It was, for all the world, like a woman's corset, and it had to be strapped on tightly to be effective. It braced my back while I carried my gear, and I wore it every day I was working. I'd take it off at night. The problem was, I didn't know when my back might give out, but I was not going to allow it to stop me covering the war in any way. And eventually, with exercise, my back did improve for a while. I had 2 of these bloody corsets made because I had to wash them. They were made of canvas with metal ribs. Sometimes I'd take it off in the field and the soldiers would say, "What the hell's that?" I'd say, "That's my flak jacket," and laugh and change the subject. A severe emotional shock jolted Davis on his return to Singapore. He had become extremely fond of a Vietnamese girl whom he hoped to marry. Letter to Aunt Lillian, 16 February 1966, Orange Grove Road, Singapore. Rather a shock awaiting me on my return to Singapore when I found my last letter to Mai returned unopened with the words L.M. Moore written across the back. Of course, I immediately contacted friends in Laos and Vietnam and received word back from one that she was reported killed but is okay. He spoke to her. Expect to receive a letter shortly from her. It is very difficult to explain, Auntie, so I won't try, but there are many, many things regarding tradition, custom, ties of country and history that make things go very, very involved for Mai. This I understand myself, and she's realised that I do, but to explain to other people is very nearly impossible. It is difficult enough even for people who live in this area. The war and distance intervened, so Mai and Neil Davis were never able to marry. She was one of the great loves of his life. Letter to Aunt Lillian, 16 February 1966. Viz News want me to go to South Korea sometime soon, also Taiwan, Japan and possibly China. Viz News are keen to keep me out of Vietnam more than before by tempting me with these other assignments. But whilst I'm eager to go, especially to Korea, I feel out of it if I'm not in Vietnam. Unfortunately, things are very bad there at present. A Singaporean Indian cameraman was shot and killed there yesterday, making the total now about 16 cameramen lost since last May. I'm still coaching my runners from here and received a cable from one to say that he had been selected to represent Tasmania in Perth late in March for the Australian Championships. Letter to Aunt Lillian, 6 May 1966, Hotel Majestic, Saigon. There have been many riots here again, and the government has been overthrown. Possibly you saw some of this on TV. I had the distinction of being arrested by the Vietnamese police one day, then managing to escape to the rioters who sheltered me. 2 days later, however, I was attacked by rioters. This time, the timely arrival of the Vietnamese paratroops saved rather an ugly scene. There was quite a bit of communist-inspired anti-Americanism at this time. All US personnel were ordered off the street in the cities for some days. Fortunately, no Americans were killed. Managed to get an exclusive interview with the Buddhist leader, Thich Tri Quang, which got very good play overseas. Letter to Aunt Lillian, 17 June 1965, Hotel Caravel, Saigon. The situation is about normal. The military have taken control of the government again, this time for good. Yesterday, Saigon's civilian air terminal was blown up, and at dawn tomorrow, 5 naughty Chinese war profiteers are to be publicly executed by firing squad in the Central Market. That about sums it up. Covering events in Saigon was often as lively as the battlefield. South Vietnam's involved political situation was further complicated by anti-government street riots involving rival Buddhist factions. There was also an anti-foreign, anti-American element to these protests, so being blonde and tall was not an advantage for a Western cameraman, generally perceived by the mobs to be American. The world was appalled in the early 1960s when Buddhist bonzes started pouring petrol over their saffron robes and publicly burning themselves in the streets as an ultimate protest. The burnings resumed early in 1966, and in the chaos of war-torn Saigon, they almost ceased to be newsworthy. There was a story that 2 American oil company executives fell into a drunken argument in the 7th floor bar of the Caravel Hotel about whether the bonzes were immolating themselves with Shell or Esso. When the military government took over in South Vietnam in June 1965, they arrested Saigon businessmen accused of war profiteering and black market activities. Most of the merchants suffering martial displeasure were Chinese. Even the Saigonese, accustomed to bizarre happenings, were jolted when the new government began public executions in the Central Market. Letter to Aunt Lillian, 3 April 1966, Biz News Office, Singapore. My first job back in Vietnam this time was to cover the execution of a Chinese businessman. His wife and 8 children turned up, so it was memorable film. I have to treat something like that as just another job. Otherwise, one would be perpetually sad. Whatever the deterrent effect the government hoped these executions would have on the local population, the publication of still pictures and news film in the wider world was a monstrous public relations disaster. Awful scenes with distraught wives and weeping children clawing coils of barbed wire as their men were shot invaded secure homes in other continents. One of Neil's close friends, Donald Wise of the London Daily Mirror, had been out of Vietnam for some months covering the Middle East and Africa. Donald, a tall man with a David Niven-style moustache, was both dashing and dapper in his well-tailored tropical suits. He had been a paratroop captain in the British Army and a prisoner of war of the Japanese on the Burma-Thailand Railway. Still in the Army after World War II, he was involved in special operations against the Malayan Communist Party during the emergency. Because Wise had been away from Saigon for so long, he asked me to drive him around while I briefed him on what had been going on. I purposely didn't mention the public executions and took him by a circuitous route which brought us back via the Central Market, where he got his first glimpse of 5 execution posts set up there surrounded by sandbags. He knew there had been executions of Viet Cong terrorists and war profiteers, but not in groups. He said, "My God, 5 executions." Donald Wise is a sensitive man who abhors violence and discrimination, but covers his feelings with a black sense of humour. I said, "Not only that, Donald, 5 in one go the other morning." "Did you see it?" "See it? I filmed it, old fellow." Wise was silent for a moment. "Christ," he said, "you have all the luck." Over the next few days, Wise had time to notice and reflect on the clasped hands-on stars and stripes stenciled on so many commodities in Saigon. It was the symbol of US aid to the Republic of South Vietnam, and the urbane British correspondent used it to get back at his mate. A few days later, Davis and Wise both covered another dawn execution in the Central Market. An open coffin lined with plastic waited on trestles barely 3 metres away from where the condemned man was being tied up. He behaved splendidly, merely asking the Vietnamese firing squad why they were shooting him. Why not, he asked, let the Americans do it. The executioners fired, the body was cut down and placed in the coffin, the bloody sand around the base of the execution post was hosed away, and the central market resumed normal commerce. As the shots rang out, Donald Wise saw a window flung open in a shop just behind the execution point. A man, obviously in ill humour because of the noise, looked down. Seeing that it was just another execution, he scratched his stomach above his pyjama trousers, yawned copiously, slammed the window shut, and presumably went back to bed. Donald Wise wrote that story for his paper, but he had not finished with Davis. He asked, "Did you get a close-up of the clasped hands on the coffin, old fellow?" Davis was aghast to have missed it. Wise let him agonise until lunchtime before he confessed that this image of Vietnamese and American friendship had not been emblazoned on the cheap pine board coffin. Davis and Wise typified the camaraderie and competition known to many foreign correspondents. Their jokes masked their mutual respect and diverted them from the horrors that shattered other people and the horror that could affect them. Davis used to joke with Wise that the British journalist would get his before Davis did, and he would be standing by laughing to film it. During the Buddhist anti-government disturbances in Saigon in 1966, there were morning and evening riots outside the Buddhist headquarters at the Vien Hoa Dao Pagoda. The demonstration was always broken up by South Vietnamese troops using tear gas, and this had happened so many times that the area seemed permanently impregnated with acrid fumes. The press got fairly used to it, and some reporters got themselves gas masks, but you could combat it with lots of lemon, handkerchiefs, and water. One morning, the demonstration was getting rowdy, and it was close on noon, the beginning of the 3-hour siesta period. The soldiers were hot and sick of it, and the rioters were getting edgy and wanted to have a good old set to so they could go home to their rice and noodles, and everybody knew that the time for the tear gas was getting close. At precisely 1 minute after 12, the rioters stormed the soldiers, who broke a few heads with batons and fired some shots in the air. Then they fired tear gas canisters. We didn't have time to get with the troops, and one canister fell right at Donald's feet, enveloping him in a cloud of gas. When it cleared some minutes later, I saw a hard-bitten South Vietnamese paratrooper who had filled his doubtless sweaty helmet with gutter water. He was swabbing Donald's face and eyes with his pretty filthy scarf and pouring some of this water into his mouth. Remembering his standing joke with Wise, Davis rolled his camera. Wise fluttered his eyelids and came to, only to see his friend almost helpless with laughter as he fixed the moment for posterity. "There you are, you silly bugger. You never thought I really would laugh when I saw you down on the ground and hit, did you?" Wise said that was dead right. He hadn't thought Davis would laugh, but now he feared that if he were really hit, Davis would die in a paroxysm of mirth. Australian troops had not long been in Vietnam at that stage, and Davis was always urging Donald Wise to go down and do a story on them. It was a bit of a sideshow for Wise's British readers, but Davis wore him down. Things did not get off to a good start when Wise stepped from his transport chopper resplendent in a skin-tight camouflage spotted parachutist uniform he had had tailor-made. It was a startling contrast to the rather baggy fatigues that the Australians wore. Two Aussie diggers leaning against a pile of sandbags took in this magnificent apparition stolidly. Then one said to the other, "Thank Christ, we're saved. Fucking Tarzan's here." Unlike the Americans and other Allied groups fighting in South Vietnam, the Australians did not welcome foreign correspondents. They had a deep-seated distrust of the press. It was known in the trade as the feel free to fuck off approach to public relations. Wise reported to Davis that he was helicoptered out to a forward position and introduced to the company sergeant major, who took him out to a bunker position. It was nearly dark, and the amiable CSM fussed around and found him a stretcher and even a mosquito net. The soldiers shared their food with him, and Wise felt that the anti-press attitudes of the Australians had been exaggerated. He woke at dawn as the troops were getting ready to move off and heard the CSM being questioned by a young officer. "Did you make Mr. Wise comfortable and welcome?" "Oh, yes, sir. We put him right out with the Point Platoon, like we do all these bloody correspondents." The Point Platoon, naturally, is the first to be attacked. Here endeth episode 6, first half of Saigon, Pearl of the Orient, which is chapter 12, of 1 crowded hour, as it appears in the book. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.